Hey everyone, welcome back to Keto and Crime and Thought Crime. Today we've got the case of Christian Longo. He was another family annihilator. Somewhere between Jeffrey McDonald and Chris Coleman came Longo, and he was actually publicized in a movie in 2015 starring Jonah Hill and James Franco. It was based on the book of the same name, True Story, Murder, Memoir, Mea Culpa, by Michael Finkel, formerly of the New York Times. Now, I do have a surprise for you. I read his book in conjunction with my research on this case, and I also reached out to Mr. Finkel, and he actually wrote me back. So I am going to try to set up an interview with him as a belated second or third part, however many parts this turns out being, of this story. So stay tuned for that. If it happens, I will bring it to you as soon as possible. So I'm very, very excited. Michael, if you're watching, please. Anyway, with that being said, thank you so much to everyone that watches. You have no idea how much that means to me. Thank you so much. In relation, I'm also going to be releasing a soon-to-be and deep dive on Jehovah's Witnesses, since the people in this case were Jehovah's Witnesses. So I wanted to do kind of a companion piece, so look for that coming out after this case. Look for that, an in-depth deep dive on Jehovah's Witnesses so you can understand some of the things we're going to be talking about. And so thank you. Stay tuned for that. If I haven't earned your subscription, I hope this is the day that I do. Please do a special shout out to my channel members and my patrons. Couldn't do this without you, and I promise you live chats are coming back, live hangouts are coming back. Just let me get some work projects aside. My schedule's been kind of cattywampus here lately, so I'm just trying to keep everything together. I'm also going back on the road for comedy next week. It's a short trip to Chattanooga, Tennessee. I'll actually be performing in Dalton, Georgia, but the wife and I are going to take a little mini stay at a hotel quarantine vacation in Chattanooga, but I will be appearing in Dalton, Georgia for 2 nights, for 2 shows with my good friend 𝗟𝗍𝗄𝗃. So I'll be opening for him, and this is good. It's a required mask, required temperature check, limited seating show. So I'm looking forward to it. It's the first time I've been back on stage in a long time, so I don't pray. Some of you don't pray, but if you do, send up a prayer. If you don't, send happy thoughts that I don't bomb. But anyway, so that's where I'll be Valentine's weekend. I'll be taking some footage, hopefully get that up for you, as well as trying to keep up with my true crime schedule. So with that being said, let's dive in. Let's start by talking about the book, True Story, written by Michael Finkel in 2005. Finkel was a longtime writer for the New York Times. He was a travel and leisure reporter along with other things. And in 2002, after pitching a story to the New York Times to kind of infiltrate the Arabic slave trade in Africa, he went to Africa, spent several months there interviewing supposed boys that had not only, some of them had sold themselves into slavery to support their families, others were sold into slavery. Because yes, that trade's very much alive and well, even in the early 2000s. And just let you know that sometimes we don't change as fast as we should. But anyway, after interviewing many of these boys, he found a lot of similarities in their stories. So instead of writing a multi-character narrative about it, he combined all the stories into the story of one boy, and he titled his article, which appeared in the New York Times magazine, "Is Yusuf Mallah a Slave?" Unfortunately, the organization Save the Children recognized the boy that they used as the photo on the cover and in the article as not being named 𝗪𝗎𝗓, and they contacted the New York Times editors, who questioned 𝗙𝗂𝗀, and he admitted that he did combine them into one person, but he also said it was because the editors wanted him to. So I don't know what went on behind closed doors. Michael's has been very nice to me, so I'm inclined to believe him. But he was fired, and they printed a retraction of the story. So as you can imagine, 𝗙𝗂𝗀, who was from the state of Montana, or at least chooses to call Montana home, of course, had to fly back home and tell his then fiancée, now wife, I believe, that he had just been fired. Boy, journalism has changed. Now they don't even check what's put out for the most part, and he got fired for something as simple as combining stories. It has changed a lot. And if I get to interview him, I will ask him some questions about that. But anyway, of course, he returned home in the early 2000s, very, secluded, snowed-in type of estate he had out there, because he loved living out in kind of the wilderness of Montana. And he actually received a call from a reporter from the Portland, Oregon. He received a call from a reporter from a local Portland, Oregon newspaper, who asked him if he wanted to comment on the Christian Longo case. He said, "Who is Christian Longo?" And he says, well, they just captured him in Mexico for murdering his entire family, and he was pretending to be Michael Finkel of the New York Times. Well, of course, this captivated and entranced the reporter, and he decided to go over to Oregon and interview Finkel in prison. And that is where he got the contents for his book. He was the only person that Longo would talk to. And he said Longo took him through quite a journey of him starting to think he was falsely accused, to, okay, he did it, but he had reasons, to the man is a psychopath and evil. So Finkel went through several iterations in this book. It was a very enjoyable read. I highly recommend it. It is on Audible. Check it out. But with that being said, that's the background of this book that I read in conjunction with a lot of other research, including a very great expose on it from True Crime Brewery. You know how great they are, as well as numerous articles, books, and other podcasts that I listen to do research for this case. So let's dive into the Christian Longo case. Christian Michael Longo was born January 23rd, 1974, and actually was raised in the state of Michigan. His parents divorced by the time he was 4, and he had been raised a Roman Catholic up until that point. It wasn't long after the divorce that his mother, Joy, met his stepfather, Joe Longo, who was in management for a local retailer, who advanced through the company, and through him they did move around a little bit. But much to the dismay of Christian, some Jehovah's Witnesses paid a visit to Joy not long after her and Joe had gotten together, and they started attending a local Kingdom Hall, and then before they know it, Christian and his mother were going door to door, leaving watchtower tracts and trying to speak to people. However, Christian was a very smart young man, and he made the most of this situation. He became very active in the Jehovah's Witnesses. From a young age, even the elders there said that he had a gift of gab, a gift of speak, a gift of talk, which will come in very valuable later on to him. And he started leading Bible study at a very young age, as well as taking the lead on many of the door-to-door. Can you imagine? You've got this little 9-year-old, 10-year-old kid preaching to you about Jehovah at the door. I would probably stop and listen just for the sake of it. And so, as a result, he became very involved in church activities, because that was really all he was allowed to do. As a witness, he was not allowed to associate with what witnesses call worldly people. And again, I'm coming out, after this case is over, I'm coming out with an in-depth analysis of the Jehovah's Witnesses, so you will be able to kind of put 2 and 2 together. So there was no extracurricular activities for the kids. They were not allowed to celebrate holidays. They were kept home whenever there was like a holiday festival or a seasonal festival at school. They were not allowed to go to sleepovers, birthday parties, because they couldn't celebrate birthdays. They were also, there was no talk of college or anything beyond learning a trade to further the kingdom of God before the end of times, which the Jehovah's Witnesses live in a never-ending fear of the end is coming nigh, like tomorrow, like next week. So that's the kind of world that Christian Longo was brought up in. Christian broke rules. He got very much into computers, as a lot of Gen X kids did. I did. Spent lots of times at the school library on those early Macs, learning about computers, reading books on computers. He also started to want to get into activities such as football, baseball. Well, as you can imagine, this is becoming too worldly. So he was pulled from public school and put into homeschool, where he was taught by his mom, Joy, who is in no way qualified to be a teacher. That's my problem with non-supervised homeschool. I have a cousin that homeschools her kids, but she's also college degreed, educated, knows how to do it, uses state-approved curriculum to do it. But then there are these religious homeschoolers that skirt around everything and teach their children absolutely nothing or just what they want them to know. And it was this kind of environment that Christian was put into. He wasn't taught much. He knew how to read, write, do arithmetic, and that was about it. Everything else he did was biblical, from Jehovah's Witnesses or Watchtower approved materials. And he also continued to go door to door, lead Bible study, was brought from the world back into the Kingdom Hall, so to speak. However, even though his love with computers waned a little bit, he was still in love with something he had picked up early on, photography. He actually bought a used camera. He actually received cameras as gifts, though they don't celebrate holidays, so I don't see who was giving him gifts. But he got cameras, and he would take very nice photography. So he was very much into cameras, film development, and so he continued to study up on these things. And as a matter of fact, once he was old enough to work and the family had relocated from where they were in rural Michigan to Ann Arbor, a college town, he actually went out and got a job at a local camera store and delved into it even more. But he never got a high school diploma or a GED or anything, so college was absolutely out of the question for him. And he continued to work minimum wage retail jobs. At the age of 19, he met Mary Jane Baker in the Kingdom Hall parking lot. She was 25, he was 19. Who was born to Susan and Jim Baker, and in 1967, she was a lifelong Jehovah's Witness. So she was raised in it. It wasn't like they came to her door and switched over. She was a lifelong Jehovah's Witness, but her father, Jim, never did buy into the faith, and as a result, never did give into it. But their mom, Susan, and her 3 siblings were raised in it. However, all 3 of her siblings did leave the faith. Mary Jane never did. She really found it an important part of her life, really took to it, never thought about anything but being a wife and mother. However, she did really well in school. And by virtue of her grades and learning some secretarial skills, she was actually able to get really well-paying jobs after she graduated. She worked her way up to a job after she had worked in some medical practices as a very skilled medical secretary. She actually got a job at the University of Michigan dental school as their administrative assistant. So this was a well-paid state of Michigan position, not minimum wage. This was a well-paid state benefited position. But yet, she wanted to be a wife and mother. She was one of the few Jehovah's Witnesses kids that weren't pulled out into homeschooling. She did actually graduate public high school. But she was not having any luck. She was only allowed to date Jehovah's Witnesses boys, and because she was already 25, she was actually considered out of her prime for marrying. Can you believe that? And so a lot of the quote-unquote eligible men around her age were already seriously courting, because again, this is a courting situation. hand-picked dating. You find that a lot. And so they were already, married, seriously courting, engaged. So her family was, and herself, seriously concerned about whether she would ever get married and have family. But then she met 19-year-old Christian Longo in one of the Ann Arbor Kingdom Hall's parking lots. Christian went to her parents and in a very traditional Jehovah's Witness kind of way asked for permission to date or court her. So her parents didn't feel, or at least her mother didn't feel, that he was worthy of dating their daughter because he still lived at home, worked in a camera store, and made not more than minimum wage. And they didn't consider him as a worthy candidate to one day marry and take care of their daughter and a potential family. So Christian, being the type of guy that wanted to get what he wanted, he actually moved out of his parents' house and in with 2 other Jehovah's Witnesses, young boys, in an apartment and beefed up his hours at the camera store, as well as working some other minimum wage jobs. Was able to purchase a car, kind of showed that he was independent and could take care of himself. And so with that and his smooth talking ways, he was able to get Susan and Jim's permission to date their daughter. So they dated. He proposed. He actually went to an Ann Arbor jewelry store and bought her a engagement ring for $3,000 on store credit. Now, at the time, he was working a minimum wage job, retail, camera store, and he's 19 years old. So this is, roughly 1993, 1994. Minimum wage in 1993, 1994 was $4.25 an hour. It was raised to $4.50 in 1996. So $4.25 an hour. He was working full time. So $4.25 an hour times 40 hours a week. He was making $170 gross. Times probably, let's say with everything, 12% taxes. He was making $150 a week. Yep, $150 a week. Times 4.25, because that's how we do, the weeks, months, that conversion. He was making $600 a month. $650 a month times 12. $7,000 a year. So he invested just about half his salary into a ring. And this would become a habit with Christian, living well beyond his means. It would also lead to the detriment of his family. Not only because he believed he should be able to afford the finer things in life, but also because Mary Jane, because she was so, not only loved him so much, but was also such a believer in the submission of women to the husband should be head of the household, that she trusted that he knew what he was doing. And this would lead to a lot of trouble later on. So he invested half a year's salary into this ring. But then, even though he thought he could possibly squeeze it, pay it off in a couple of years, he wasn't really worried about it. But then his car, which was kind of a clunker, broke down. And then one of his roommates stopped paying his rent. So he had to take the payment that he had set aside to pay on the ring to take care of his car and a double portion of rent. So as a result, he stole some cash from the camera store to make the payment on the ring. And the manager confronted all the employees, asked who did it. No one owned up to it. But Christian, the next day, wrote a confession explaining what happened and also wrote a check in the exact amount that was taken from the register and left it for his boss the next day. Of course, he was fired, and the camera store pressed charges. So he's in trouble. And his 2 roommates, because they were good little Jehovah's Witnesses, ratted on him, and he got thrown out of the Kingdom Hall. This had double jeopardy. Because he's been thrown out of the Kingdom Hall, technically his parents are supposed to shun him Mary Jane is supposed to break off her relationship, and her family is supposed to shun him because he has broken the covenant. But because of his smooth talking and his own parents, as well as Mary Jane's mother, pled with the elders to make an exception that he did it out of need. Within Jehovah's Witnesses, there's a belief about situational morality or situational immorality, which I will cover in my Jehovah's Witness video, where maybe there's a little bit of gray area. So they use that, and as a result, they let him back into the congregation, but because of what he did, they would not let he and Mary Jane be married in the Kingdom Hall, but they would allow a Jehovah's Witness elder to perform the ceremony outside the Kingdom Hall. So it was kind of like, okay, we'll let you back in. Slap. Anyway, he still, though, had not told his family that there was actually a warrant out for his arrest for the theft. He had managed to keep that part. The Jehovah's Witnesses his roommates only told about him actually taking the money. So, he's got an outstanding warrant that he isn't taken care of. So he and Mary Jane got married. They got an apartment to themselves, and they furnished it by use of credit. In the 90s, credit cards were free-flowing. That's the beginning of what we know as the credit crisis. So they were free-flowing. He was able to get, because he and Mary Jane at the time, she was still working at the University of Michigan, so she had her salary, and he had gotten another minimum wage job. So they had income, and they were able to get all these credit cards, and that's how they funded their life. They bought everything on credit, every piece of furniture, every appliance, everything that they needed in their apartment. They were buying on credit, and either with in-store credit or cards, and they weren't making a single solitary payment on it. Why? Because Mary Jane, her check went into their joint account, and she relied on her husband, who's the head of household, to pay the bills. Well, he wasn't doing it. He was just blowing the money elsewhere. And so they, within a few months, were being sued by just about every creditor they had. In addition, Christian was just as reckless when it came to driving. Between 1992 and 1996, he had 7 traffic violations and had a suspended license. And he got pulled over for another 8th infraction, and then the warrant for this, he was driving on a suspended license, and the warrant for that camera store theft came up. He got arrested, and Mary Jane just bailed him out without a question asked. After they dealt with that, he did make a pledge to Mary Jane that he would get on the straight and narrow, and as a result, he got a job for a local newspaper distributor that distributed the New York Times. He was promoted to Midwest Regional Manager, so he did a good job. He was in charge of all of the paper handlers, the paper boys, the paper girls, the paper deliverers. I had in my early 20s, I had a local newspaper route. So I know you can make decent money, and our regional managers made decent money. So he did that, and he was quite good at it. And that's where he started reading the New York Times and got enthralled with Michael Finkel's writing. And so that's where he knew Michael Finkel from. And so, but he wouldn't tell people he worked for a distributor. He said that he worked for the New York Times. He would use that. And of course, it was much more prestigious to say you work for the New York Times than I work for a newspaper distributor. Anyway, he made decent money, probably equal to what Mary Jane was making at the University of Michigan. But again, they kept overspending. He just kept overspending. There would be new stuff turn up in their apartment all the time. Mary Jane didn't confront him because she was the good submissive wife. But her family, particularly her siblings that had long since left the faith, were really concerned about his overspending and wondered where it came from, because they knew he was, even though he was a regional manager, it couldn't pay that well. And then boom, Mary Jane gets pregnant with their first 2 children, Zach, and then later on, about 10 months later, Sadie. So they came along really quickly. And as a result, to help their growing family, Mary Jane's parents actually bought what was going to be a rental property for them, but they actually sold it self-financed it for Christian and Mary Jane. And so it was a very good deal. It was kind of a rent-to-own situation. They would pay them the payments. They would pay the mortgage company. And then once it's paid off, the house is theirs. So it allowed them to get a house without having to run a credit check because they were in so much trouble. But because this was her lifelong dream and she feared that her job would take away from her ability to be a mother, and that any income she was making would be eaten up with daycare, Mary Jane decided to stay at home. And so now Christian, on his newspaper distribution salary, is taking on everything. Plus, they had state of Michigan health benefits as long as Mary Jane was working, but now they didn't. So they had to roll over onto whatever benefits this New York Times distributor had, which wasn't as good as the state of Michigan, I guarantee you. So now they would probably have medical bills, higher premiums coming out of his check, and he couldn't do it. He was not making enough money. And then not long after Sadie was born, he got a notice from his employer that he needed to go to San Francisco for a regional meeting. He went, and he came back unemployed. Now, we don't know what happened there. He claims that he quit because they wanted him to move the family out of Michigan. He didn't want to do that, so he quit. But on the flip side, they said he was fired because he was doing some kind of shady things at work. Knowing his history, I'm inclined to believe they fired him, but I don't know for sure. But anyway, he came back from that regional meeting unemployed. And he took a job selling fireplaces and spas for a local home builder, which was about half of his newspaper distribution salary. But guess what? He kept spending. He had 14 maxed out credit cards between him and Mary Jane. Kept spending. Then he started writing bad checks for their rent/mortgage payment to Mary Jane's parents, and was evidently having an affair because Mary Jane found proof in his personal email. Now, a lot of people allege that's where a lot of the money was going, is to keep up a girlfriend. Now, he alleges there was never any physical contact. It was just emotional, that he needed someone to talk to. I don't know about you, but I'm not quite buying that. In 1998, he bought a $3,500 jet ski from a local dealer. I don't know how he was able to do it, but he did it, and then he turned around and sold it in a private sale, never once making a payment. So now he has the idea that he can start paying his bills by doing unscrupulous things like this. So again, he also went to a local Dodge dealer and leased a brand new Durango, never once made a lease payment. Meanwhile, Mary Jane has begged her parents for mercy and has gotten them kind of a stay on the payments. And due to the sale of the essentially stolen jet ski, he was able to pay off the back payments to his in-laws, as well as catch up and pay a little bit ahead. So he got them squared away, but they didn't realize what he had done to get there. Meanwhile, third daughter Madison is born in 1998. And now they're even deeper in the hole because his job is paying half as much, and he's now in hock for all this other stuff that he couldn't afford, that he never intended to make a payment on anyway. They also did what a lot of people have been known to do. They leveraged the equity in the house and took out a home equity loan to pay off some of the traffic tickets and to make some of the credit payments so that it all wouldn't come crashing down on them. Meanwhile, Mary Jane's car that they had bought early in their marriage is repossessed, and he gets more traffic tickets. So, Christian. In 1999, Chris discovered the wonderful world of fake driver's licenses and was able to makeshift a state of Michigan driver's license under the name of Jason Joseph Fortner, and took the driver's license into a local dealership, another one where he did not buy, lease the Durango of late and asked to take a brand new Montana minivan out on a test drive. The salesman made a copy of his license and he left for the test drive. He said he just wanted to let his wife see it before he bought it. Never came back. Just took that Montana right on home. And because he had put a vanity plate on the Durango, and in that time in the state of Michigan, vanity plates were only attached to the person, not a vehicle, not the actual VIN for some reason of the vehicle. So he was able just to switch out the vanity plate, took and got another vanity plate for the Durango, and so now he had license plates on both vehicles that made them appear that they were registered. Because, as I said, in the state of Michigan, in the late 90s, a vanity plate, one that has a special writing, the one on the minivan actually said kid van. They were only tied to the name of the person that registered the vehicle, not to a specific vehicle. It's not like now where when you sell a vehicle, basically the license plate goes with it. No, not in Michigan, not at that time. So that would never be able to happen today unless somebody was really good at faking stuff. But he was able to get that on there with no trouble. So anyway, now we're at Grand Theft Auto, selling of stolen goods, and faking driver's licenses. And we're just getting started. Because in part 2 of Christian Longo, we're going to discover how he creates a whole business and a criminal enterprise that leads to the annihilation of his family. And with that, I'll be back real soon with part 2 of Christian Longo. Until next time, keto and cry.